The disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, was it this individual's sin that caused the blindness, or that of the parents?" "Neither," answered Jesus. "It was to let God's works shine forth in this person." In the name of the living God, amen. Be seated. I am a sinner, and so are you. And it's okay. We don't talk about this enough. Sin, I mean. Or maybe we talk about it too much, just in the wrong way. As the church throughout the centuries unto millennia, we have done a terrible job talking about, addressing, wrestling with sin. We have weaponized that word and used it against one another, particularly against those among us who are different or who make the majority feel uncomfortable or insecure. People of color, women, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people. People who are fat or thin, people who like to stay out late and dance on tables, people who get piercings and tattoos, people, especially those who identify as women, who just really, really, really enjoy the holy gift of sex. We have weaponized the word sin with warheads of shame, and we have developed excellent targeting capacity that enables us to take out a certain person or even an entire group while miraculously leaving everyone else standing around seemingly unscathed. We have done such a terrible job as the church talking about addressing and wrestling with sin that our great temptation now is not to talk about it at all for fear of triggering traumas old and not so old, for fear of being associated with the violence of the past, violence that still is perpetrated by the church and many others today. And yet we do that at our own deep peril. Because whether we talk about, address, and wrestle with it or not, sin is out there and sin is in here. And we know it. And as this morning's gospel tells us, it is deeply tied to how we live in community. It is deeply tied to what we do with our wounds. It is deeply tied to whether we will be a community of hiding or healing, a community of excluding or embracing, a community of death or life. Sin is out there and sin is in here, and we know it. We bear its burden on our heart, and it is, oh, so heavy. And until together we acknowledge it and talk about it and address it and wrestle with it and offer it all to God, we are destined to each carry it alone. The remembrance of our sin grievous unto us, its burden intolerable. And so we need to talk about sin, and I need to start by saying again, I am a sinner. Oh God, am I a sinner? And I know you are too. And it's okay. The word sin that our gospel uses is various versions of the Greek hamartano, and it literally means to miss the mark. To miss hitting a target. There is no assumption of malice or evil intent. Sin is oops and ouch, albeit sometimes on an enormous scale of breadth and depth. I am, you are, each of us and all of us, a sinner. We screw up all the time. And I am, you are, each of us and all of us created in God's image and created beautiful and good as we are. And nothing can change that. And that's where we need to start. That is always where we need to start. That's where Jesus starts in this morning's gospel. A person is brought to him who has not been able to see since the moment of birth. And that has relegated him to the margins of society as a beggar. And Jesus' disciples, perhaps beginning the great tradition of Jesus' disciples, getting it staggeringly wrong about sin, ask him, Rabbi, was it this individual's sin that caused him to be born this way, or that of the parents? And Jesus immediately rejects the question. No. How we are created is never, never, never about sin. Jesus gives the answer that he gives for all of us, for each of us. You were born as you are, that God's works might shine forth in you as you are. How did we get this so staggeringly wrong as the church for so long and do such deep damage getting it wrong? How did we do this when Jesus is so clear about this right here? How we are created is never about sin. Each of us is created as we are, as what color we are, as what sexual orientation we are, as where on the gender spectrum we are, as how differently abled we are. Each of us is created as we are in God's image and beautiful and good. And there is nothing about how you were created. There is nothing about who you are that you need to be healed from or forgiven of to be in God's image and beautiful and good. And as we are, you, me, each of us has a gift, a word that God puts on our lips and in our lives. You were born as you are, so that God's works might shine forth in you as you are. Do you understand? I mean, do you really feel me here? You were born for God to shine through you. You were born to live into the deepest reality of life that I am, you are. We are created in God's image, created out of love, for love, and to love. That is what we mean when we say God dwells in you. You were born as you are so that God's works might shine forth in you as you are. And by the way, if you are transgender, that means God's works shine forth in you wherever you are in your transition. I am, you are, we all are created in God's image, beloved and good, and nothing can change that. And yes, we don't live into that most of the time. We sin. We miss the mark. We act in decidedly unimage of God-like ways. Sometimes despite our best efforts, and sometimes with vindictive and intentional and destructive fervor. And we wound one another. We wound creation and we wound ourselves. We do. We know it, don't we? And it's awful. It's just awful. But as awful as it is, it doesn't change the fact that I am, you are, all are created in God's image and good. As awful as it is, it doesn't change the fact that God says, beloved, you were born as you are so that my works might shine forth in you as you are. And if you have trouble believing that, if you have trouble trusting that, if the times you sin, the times you miss the mark are weighing so heavily on your spirit that you doubt your goodness and belovedness, if the voices in your head and in your heart are telling you that who you are is not worthy of revealing God, then just know that that's a big club. And that one reason I am preaching this so passionately is while I have no problem believing this for you, I too struggle mightily with believing it for myself. And so let's talk about the struggle. Let's talk about sin. Because I'm a sinner, and so are you, and it's okay. because we do miss the mark. We sin. But sin is not about who we are, but about how much we miss the mark in living into who we are. Jesus does point out sin in this gospel story, but it is not about the person born without physical sight. The sin Jesus points out is the religious leaders who couldn't see beyond how the person was born and embrace his potential to reveal the divine to them and to the world. The religious leaders who cared more for law and order than love and justice. The religious leaders who used fear as a weapon and drove out the one who spoke an uncomfortable truth. Jesus does point out sin in this gospel story, and we better pay attention because sin is real and sin is powerful. And sin, individual sin, corporate sin, systemic sin, sin done on our behalf and for our benefit, sin wounds and wounds deeply. Sin is when we wound each other, when we exclude each other, and when we objectify and use each other. Sin is when we use fear against one another and practice domination instead of companionship. Sin is when we fail to see the beauty and potential to bear God's truth that is in every single person without exception. Sin is when we live without grace. Sin is retributive justice instead of restorative justice. Sin is when we adopt purity tests for worthiness and cast out any who don't meet the standards that we set. Jesus does point out sin in this gospel story, and we better pay attention because sin is real, and sin is powerful, and sin wounds and wounds deeply, and those wounds cause pain and fear, and when we act out of that pain and fear, it can lead us into more sin, more missing the mark, and less living and loving like the beloved images of God were born to and born as. And Jesus has something to say about that too. Because while Jesus doesn't see the sin in the person before him, he does see the wound. Jesus sees the pain caused by a life of ostracization because of how this person was born. And Jesus knows what to do with a wound. He doesn't hide it. He doesn't condemn it. And he certainly doesn't cast it out. He names it. And he exposes it to the air and lets it breathe. And he gets his hands dirty and he touches it. And he lets it get on him and him get on it. And he works together in community with the wounded person, and with God's grace, healing happens. And Jesus didn't drive out the one with the wound, didn't drive out the one who was different. But when the others drove him out, Jesus went and found him. That's who we are. That is God's dream for us. That is a life worthy of images of God. And as a church throughout the century, even unto today, we have sinned. We have missed the mark of that dream mightily. As the church, when we have not only called who people are created as sinful, but when our attitude toward true sin has been casting out, we have not been a community of healing. Throughout the centuries, as we have weaponized that word sin, we have been a community where all will very quickly learn in shame to hide their sin and to hide the wounds from which it so often springs. And that's a community where wounds do not heal, but fester. That's a community not of life, but of slow death, and far too often that has been the case. Far too often, we as the church have been the community of condemnation and exclusion, and not the community of healing. And the community of healing is what we are called to be. That is our best, most joyful destiny. Communities that talk about sin and deal with our wounds honestly are communities of healing. They are communities where we don't hide our wounds and we don't hide our sin either. We don't hide our mistakes and the places we have fallen down, but we show them to one another, our wounds and our sins, and we lay them on this table before God, and we leave them open to and become a part of the earthiness, the messiness, the spit and muddiness of healing. And that can only happen if we become communities of restoration instead of communities of retribution. God has a dream for us, each of us and all of us, and it is a dream of beauty and truth, of health and healing. It is a dream where each and every one of God's children around the world hears God lovingly whisper in our ear, you were born as you are, so that my works might shine forth in you as you are. It is a dream where when we hurt one another, the creation and ourselves, we name it. And we lament it with healing tears, and in love call one another and ourselves to a better life where we name it and lament it not out of a thirst for revenge or exerting power over, but out of a quest for healing and a seeking of the power of walking with. The disciples asked Jesus, "Who sinned?" And really the answer is, good Lord, who hasn't? And so we need to talk about sin. But the question isn't whom shall we blame or who shall we cast out? The question is how shall we heal? And I am so grateful that that is the question. I am so grateful for a Jesus who helps me see what is sin and what is not. I am so grateful for a Jesus who looks on my own sin with love and longs for restoration and not retribution. I am so grateful for a Jesus who looks at my wounds and will spit in the dirt and rub the mud in them, on them, and over them, mixing my wounds with his, making them holy, reminding me that I am holy too. Because that Jesus invites me to stand here and say to you without shame that I am a sinner. And so are you. And it is okay. Amen.